The world tends to be a loud and demanding place, a constant stream of commerce and noise that seeks to convince you that life is a problem to be solved through accumulation and tireless defense. There is a relentless rhythm to the day, a frantic pulse of striving and securing, where the mind becomes a ledger of debts and possessions, measuring the self by what is held and what is owed. When the sun retreats and the clamor of the streets finally recedes, a different kind of silence emerges, one that does not merely signify the absence of sound, but reveals the presence of a profound and unsettling emptiness. In this stillness, the arithmetic of survival often begins to run through the mind, a persistent counting of what might be lost or what might never arrive as the shadows of tomorrow grow long and heavy. It is in these quiet hours that the weight of precarity feels most tangible, as if the very foundation of the world is composed of shifting sand rather than stone. One might think of a traveler who walks through a great city, so preoccupied with the weight of the coins in his purse that he fails to notice the beauty of the architecture or the grace of the people passing by. He is constantly checking his pockets, his eyes cast downward, his spirit tethered to the metal in his hand, and in his attempt to secure his journey, he has lost the ability to actually experience it. The mind, in its infinite and often painful creativity, takes the simple reality of a need and weaves it into a vast, suffocating tapestry of catastrophe, treating a future event as if it were a present wound. This is the nature of the second arrow, that subtle and piercing cruelty where the initial sting of a circumstance is compounded by the relentless mental effort of resisting it, creating a suffering that is far more expansive than the original hardship itself. There is a peculiar exhaustion in the attempt to build a fortress out of things that are inherently fleeting, a struggle to grasp the wind and turn it into something solid and permanent. The Buddha observed that the mind is often like a restless monkey, leaping from branch to branch, never finding a place to rest because it is always reaching for fruit that is just out of reach or mourning a branch that has already broken. Perhaps the truth is far more radical than the pursuit of safety, suggesting that the sense of insecurity is not a failure of planning, but a natural consequence of trying to find permanence in a universe defined by change. The river flows, the seasons turn, and the stars themselves are in a state of constant beautiful decay. To expect the world to stand still and offer a permanent sanctuary is to demand that the ocean cease its movement. Peace may not be found in the accumulation of a shield that can withstand every blow, but in the recognition that the wind will always blow, and that there is a certain quiet dignity in standing amidst the storm without the need to own the sky. The architecture of the self is often built upon the most precarious of foundations, constructed from the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we ought to be. There is a profound tension between the person who moves through the world, performing roles, meeting obligations, and navigating the intricacies of social expectation, and the silent, observing presence that remains unchanged by the shifting drama of the ego. Much of the inner turmoil that characterizes the human condition arises from the attempt to force the observer to become the actor, to compel the vast, unconditioned witness to shrink itself down into a manageable identity that can be defended and promoted. We spend much of our lives trying to polish the surface of this identity, smoothing over the imperfections and hiding the cracks, failing to realize that the light is most clearly seen when it passes through the openings in the vessel. This relentless striving for a perfected self creates a shadow that follows every movement, a heavy, dark companion made of all the parts of ourselves we have deemed unacceptable or unworthy. We treat our thoughts as if they were absolute truths, as if the passing clouds of anxiety or the sudden storms of anger were the sky itself, forgetting that the sky remains vast, clear, and unaffected by the weather that moves through it. The mind has a remarkable capacity for creating a sense of separation, building walls between the self and the world, between the observer and the observed, until we feel like isolated islands adrift in an indifferent ocean. This perceived isolation is the root of a loneliness that no amount of external connection can truly satisfy. For it is a loneliness born of the illusion that we are fundamentally separate from the fabric of existence. To see the world as something external, to be conquered or managed, is to live in a state of perpetual friction, a constant grinding of the soul against the reality of what is. There is a profound wisdom in the recognition that much of what we call our self is merely a collection of habits, memories, and reactions. A stream of consciousness that is always changing, never staying the same for even a single moment. When the grip of attachment is loosened, the world does not become less vivid. Rather, the colors become more intense because they are no longer being filtered through the lens of personal need or fear. There is a certain grace in the acceptance of limitation, a quiet strength in knowing that we cannot control the movements of the tides or the decisions of others, and that the only realm of true agency lies in the quality of our own presence. This is not a call to passivity, but a move toward a more integrated way of being, where action arises not from a sense of frantic necessity, but from a place of centered clarity. The weight of judgment, whether it is directed inward toward our own perceived failures or outward toward the perceived failings of the world, acts as a constant, draining energy that pulls us away from the actual texture of the present moment. We live so much in the memory of what was or the anticipation of what might be that the actual life, the singular, unrepeatable reality of this very instant, slips through our fingers like fine sand. The past is a ghost that haunts the present with its regrets and its glories, and the future is a phantom that threatens us with its uncertainties. Yet neither has any substance of its own. They are only mental constructs layered upon the immediate experience of being. To reside in the present is not to ignore the lessons of history or the responsibilities of the future, but to engage with them from a position of stability rather than one of reaction. There is a deep, underlying wholeness that exists beneath the fragmented layers of our personality, a stillness that remains even when the mind is a tempest of racing thoughts and conflicting desires. This wholeness is not something to be achieved or earned. It is not a destination at the end of a long and arduous journey of self-improvement. It is the substrate upon which all experience occurs, the quiet space in which the entire dance of life takes place. When we stop trying to fix the dance and instead recognize the space, the nature of our struggle begins to shift. The suffering that arises from the insistence that things must be different than they are begins to lose its grip, leaving behind a space for a more compassionate and patient engagement with the messiness of being human. There is a great relief in the realization that we do not have to be the architects of the entire universe, that we are not solely responsible for the alignment of the stars or the turning of the world. We are part of a vast, interconnected web of causality, a complex tapestry of cause and effect that extends far beyond our individual perception. To see this interconnectedness is to realize that nothing exists in isolation, that the tree, the wind, the soil, and the sun are all participants in a single, continuous event. This realization can be terrifying to the ego, which seeks to maintain its boundaries and its autonomy, but it is deeply nourishing to the spirit, which seeks to return to its true home in the totality of existence. The fear of death, which is perhaps the most profound of all human anxieties, is often the shadow cast by our attachment to the temporary forms we have taken. We cling to the vessel, forgetting that the water within it is part of the great ocean, and that the form is merely a temporary configuration of elements that will eventually return to their source. This return is not an end, but a transformation, a movement from one state of being into another, as natural and inevitable as the falling of a leaf or the setting of the sun. To accept this flow is to move through the world with a lightness of being, a sense of being unburdened by the need to possess or to preserve. This lightness does not mean a lack of care, but rather a care that is not possessive, a love that does not seek to bind or to control. It is a love that is like the sunlight, shining on everything without preference, without judgment, and without the need to hold on to anything. As we move through the various seasons of life, we encounter the inevitable winters of loss and the sudden springs of joy, and each comes with its own unique rhythm and its own particular lessons in impermanence. The seasons do not struggle against their own nature. The winter does not mourn the loss of the summer, nor does the spring feel a sense of pride in its own blossoming. They simply occur as part of the unfolding movement of the whole. To live in harmony with this movement is to find a sense of peace that is not dependent on favorable circumstances, but is rooted in the fundamental acceptance of the nature of reality. There is a quietude that comes when we stop fighting the current and instead learn to float upon it, allowing the intelligence of the whole to guide us through the complexities of the human experience. This is not an escape from life, but a deeper immersion into it, a way of being that is fully present for the joy and the sorrow alike without being swept away by either. We are more than the stories we tell about ourselves. We are more than the thoughts that race through our minds or the emotions that surge through our hearts. We are the space in which all these things arise and pass away, the silent witness to the constant flux of existence. In this recognition, there is a profound sense of freedom, a liberation from the heavy burden of the self that we have carried for so long. The world continues to turn, the clouds continue to drift, and the light continues to dance upon the surface of things, and we are part of this grand unfolding mystery, held in the embrace of a reality that is far more vast and more beautiful than our limited perceptions could ever suggest. There is a quiet dignity in simply being, in standing amidst the complexity and the chaos of life, and recognizing that, despite all the noise and the striving, the essence of being remains untouched, serene, and profoundly whole. In the end, perhaps the greatest wisdom is not found in the acquisition of answers, but in the capacity to sit with the questions, to dwell in the mystery, and to find a sense of belonging in the very heart of the unknown. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from the labor of the hands, but from the ceaseless arithmetic of the spirit, that relentless tallying of what is possessed and what is owed, what is certain and what is vanishing. In the stillness when the world has grown quiet, the mind often begins its frantic work of building walls against the tide that cannot be stemmed, constructing elaborate structures of security out of numbers and predictions, as if by solving the equation of tomorrow, one might finally achieve a state of permanent safety. This dread is a heavy, invisible weight, a phantom pressure that speaks of scarcity and the looming shadow of insufficiency, making the heart feel small and precarious in a vast, indifferent universe. It is the ache of the collector who seeks to gather enough to finally feel whole, or the terror of the traveler who fears they have brought too little for a road that never ends. There was once a merchant who spent his entire life gathering grain, building silos so high they touched the clouds, and counting each kernel with a devotion that bordered on prayer, believing that if he could only secure enough, he would finally know peace. He lived in constant vigilance, watching the horizon for storms and the markets for fluctuations, his mind always 1,000 miles ahead of his feet, calculating the cost of the next season before the current one had even passed. He became a prisoner of his own abundance, for even when his granaries were overflowing, he felt only the terror of the potential void, the gnawing anxiety that the wheel of fortune might turn and leave him with nothing. He had succeeded in securing his body perhaps, but he had lost the ability to inhabit his own life, for he was never truly present in the sunlight or the conversation, but always lost in the mathematics of his own survival. The weight of this worry often stems from a profound misunderstanding of the nature of what we call security, for we treat the fluctuations of fortune as if they were failures of character or flaws in our design, rather than the natural, shifting movement of the world itself. We mistake the external conditions of our existence, the coins in a purse, the status of a home, the stability of a career for the foundation of our being, forgetting that these things are like the weather, passing through our lives without ever being truly ours to hold. The Stoic wisdom suggests that the only true possessions are those that cannot be taken away by a change in the market or a shift in the wind, which are the movements of the mind and the integrity of the soul. Everything else is a loan from the universe, a temporary arrangement of atoms that we are permitted to enjoy for a time, but which we must eventually return without protest when the season demands it. To live in constant fear of lack is to suffer twice, for there is the original hardship of circumstance, and then there is the secondary, much more agonizing suffering we create by our refusal to accept the inherent instability of all things. It is the second arrow, as the Buddha once spoke of the pain we inflict upon ourselves through our own grasping and our refusal to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty. One arrow may strike us through a sudden loss or a difficult season, but the second arrow is the one we fire into ourselves with every thought that rehearses a catastrophe that has not yet happened, every worry that tries to solve a future that does not exist. We torment ourselves with the ghosts of unlived days, treating the imagination as if it were a prophecy, and in doing so, we lose the only reality we have ever truly possessed, the immediate, unfolding moment. Consider the traveler who walks along a mountain path carrying a heavy pack filled with stones he believes he will need for the journey ahead. He spends his energy adjusting the straps, worrying about the weight, and fretting over whether he has enough stones to build a shelter if the rain falls. But he is so occupied with the management of his burdens that he never sees the wildflowers blooming at his feet or the majesty of the peaks above him. He is traveling, but he is not experiencing the journey. He is merely managing a series of potential crises. He fails to see that the path itself provides what is needed, that the mountain does not demand he carry the weight of the entire range, and that the true burden is not the stones in his pack, but the way he clings to them even when the path is clear and the sun is warm. There is a profound difference between the necessity of sustenance and the hunger of craving. One is a requirement for the body, while the other is a void within the spirit that no amount of accumulation can ever truly fill. We often find ourselves chasing a horizon of enough, believing that once we reach a certain threshold, the anxiety will cease and we will finally be allowed to rest. Yet the horizon moves as we approach it, and the mind, having mastered one level of acquisition, immediately begins to eye the next. This is the trap of the seeker who thinks that security is a destination one arrives at rather than a way of walking through a world that is, by its very nature, groundless. We try to stand on water by clutching it more tightly, by grasping at the ripples and trying to freeze them into ice. But the more we struggle to make the surface solid, the more we disturb the very stillness we seek. The wise person is one who learns to walk upon the shifting sands without the need for a floor of granite, understanding that the lack of a permanent foundation is not a defect of life, but its fundamental characteristic. To be at home in both the feast and the famine is to realize that the internal landscape of the self is not dictated by the external landscape of circumstance. When the coffers are full, one can be content without being possessed by the fullness. When the coffers are empty, one can be tranquil without being broken by the void. This is not a call to indifference, but a call to a deeper kind of presence, one that does not require the world to be predictable in order to be peaceful. There was an old woman who lived in a small cottage by the sea, and she had known many years of great scarcity, where the cupboard was often bare and the winter winds bit through the cracks in the door. She did not spend her days calculating her misfortunes or mourning the life she might have led had she been born into wealth. Instead, she watched the tides, which brought in and took away with a rhythm that was both relentless and beautiful. She understood that the ocean did not hold on to its treasures, and neither could she. When her neighbors lamented the passing of their fortunes, She would simply say that the sea gives and the sea takes, and the beauty is found in the movement, not in the accumulation. She was never truly poor, for she had mastered the art of being enough for herself, and her heart was a vessel that remained steady even when the waves grew high. It is a heavy thing to realize that we cannot control the economy, the whims of fate, or the unpredictable movements of the future. And for many, this realization feels like a fall into an abyss. Yet, if we look closer, we may find that this lack of control is actually the gateway to a profound liberation. When we stop trying to master the uncontrollable, we are left with the only thing that remains: our capacity to witness, to be, and to meet whatever arises with a quiet and steady heart. The anxiety of the future is a shadow cast by an imagined sun. It has no substance of its own, yet we allow it to darken our entire vision. We spend our lives trying to build a fortress against the inevitable, not realizing that the most profound peace is found not behind thick walls, but in the open field, standing amidst the wind and knowing that we are part of the wind itself. There is a certain grace in the surrender to the impermanent, a quiet dignity in accepting that we are walking on ground that is constantly shifting beneath our feet. We spend so much of our vitality trying to solidify the ephemeral, trying to turn the flowing river of time into a static pool of security. But the river is its nature to move, and our nature is to move with it. To resist this movement is to invite the friction of suffering. To flow with it is to find a sense of being carried, even in the midst of the storm. The dread of not having enough is often the cry of a self that is trying to find its permanence in things that are inherently transient, looking for an anchor in the clouds. Perhaps the true wealth is not found in the absence of want, but in the absence of the fear of want, a state of being where the soul is no longer a beggar at the gates of fortune, but a guest who is content with whatever the host provides. This is the peace of the one who has seen that the wheel turns for all, and that the only constant is the turning itself. In the quiet hours, when the mind begins its frantic tallying once more, there is an opportunity to recognize the dance of the numbers for what it is, a mental construct, a flickering shadow on the wall of the cave, and to return to the steady, silent pulse of the present moment, which remains regardless of the balance in the bank or the uncertainty of the dawn. There is a persistent, heavy arithmetic that begins to run in the silence, a frantic calculation of what is owed, what is held, and what might be lost to the shifting tides of a world that demands tribute for every inch of space we occupy. The mind becomes a ledger keeper of shadows, tallying up the debts of the past and the potential ruins of the future, building a fortress of worry out of numbers and names of things that have not yet arrived. It is an exhausting, invisible labor, this project of trying to engineer a safety that feels perpetually just out of reach, as if security were a destination one could eventually arrive at if only the math were slightly more favorable or the timing slightly more precise. There is an ache in this precarity, a profound sense that the ground beneath one's feet is made of sand, and that the struggle to find solid footing is the primary work of a life. There is an old story of a traveler who spent his entire journey obsessed with the weight of his pack, constantly checking the straps and mourning the stones he had collected, terrified that he would be too heavy to cross the next bridge or too light to withstand the wind. He looked so intently at his load that he never saw the mountain peaks, nor did he notice the flowers blooming in the valleys, for his entire existence had been reduced to the management of his possessions. He lived in a state of perpetual preparation for a catastrophe that might never come, and in doing so, he missed the only reality that was ever actually present, the steady, rhythmic sound of his own footsteps on the earth. The wisdom of the ages suggests that this frantic grasping is a misunderstanding of the nature of being, a belief that we can build a wall high enough to keep out the inherent instability of the universe. We treat fortune as if it were a stable landscape we could inhabit, when it is actually a river, constantly moving, constantly changing its course, indifferent to our desire for stasis. To seek absolute security in the world of things is to attempt to stand upon the surface of a moving stream by clutching at the water. The more tightly one grips, the more the liquid slips through the fingers, leaving nothing but the exhaustion of the reach. True wealth, when viewed through the lens of a deeper understanding, is not the accumulation of an abundance that protects us from the world, but the cultivation of a spirit that is at home in the world, whether it offers a feast or a famine. There is a distinction to be made between the actual hardship of having little and the immense, crushing suffering caused by the fear of having little. The first is a circumstance of the body and the environment, a challenge to be met with practical care. The second is a storm of the mind, a second arrow shot into the heart by our own hand, an amplification of the original wound through the agony of anticipation and the constant gnawing sense of deficiency. The first arrow strikes, but the second arrow is our response. It is the what if, the how will I, and the it shouldn't be this way. And it is this second arrow that creates the profound, soul-deep exhaustion of anxiety. Consider the merchant who lived in a city of great wealth, a man who had spent decades building a granary so vast it could feed a kingdom, and who spent every waking hour guarding the locks and counting the sacks. He believed that his peace was contained within the walls of his storehouse, and he lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror that the granary might be emptied by fire or flood or thief. He had become a slave to his own security, a prisoner of the very things he thought would set him free. One day, a great drought came, and the granary emptied as all things eventually do. Yet, the merchant found that the terror he had lived with for 40 years was far more taxing than the hunger he faced in the drought, for the terror was a weight he had carried even when the granaries were full. The mind often treats the future as if it were a country we can inhabit, a place where we can finally rest once we have solved the equations of our current distress. We project our consciousness into a hypothetical tomorrow, attempting to solve problems that do not exist in the present, and in doing so, we abandon the only time in which we are actually alive. We treat the present moment as a mere obstacle to be overcome, a waiting room for a more stable version of ourselves that arrives once the bills are paid and the uncertainty is banished. But the future is a phantom, a collection of mental images that have no substance, and, To suffer because of them is to be tormented by a ghost. There is a profound freedom that arises when one recognizes that the wheel of fortune turns for everyone, and that the capacity to rise is inextricably linked to the necessity of falling. The person who is prepared for loss is never truly lost, for they have already made peace with the impermanence that governs all things. This is not a call to indifference or a dismissal of the legitimate needs of the body, but an invitation to a different kind of relationship with the world. One where we meet the ebb and flow of circumstance with a steady heart, understanding that our value is not tied to the fluctuations of our external status. There is a parable of a woman who lived by a great, unpredictable river. She spent her life building a dam to keep the water from her garden, working day and night to reinforce the barriers, always terrified of the next spring flood. She was so consumed by the labor of containment that she forgot to enjoy the very garden she was trying to protect. One year, the river rose with a strength she had never seen, and the dam broke, washing away the stones and the wood she had labored over for years. As she stood watching the water reclaim the land, she felt a strange, sudden lightness. The burden of the struggle, the constant tension of the defense, had been lifted by the very event she had spent her life fearing. She realized that she had been fighting the river her entire life, when she might have simply been learning to live alongside it. The tension of life comes from our demand that the world be something other than what it is, that it be predictable, that it be fair, that it be permanent. We suffer because we wish to freeze the dance, to hold a single note of a melody and make it last forever. But the beauty of the music is found in the movement between the notes, in the very fact that each sound must pass to allow the next to emerge. To live is to walk upon a ground that is constantly shifting, and to find peace is not to demand that the ground become solid, but to develop the grace to move with its undulations. When the mind begins its nocturnal tallying, it is often because it has lost sight of the distinction between what is within the reach of our will and what belongs to the vast, indifferent movement of the cosmos. We spend a tremendous amount of energy attempting to control the uncontrollable, the economy, the whims of employers, the sudden shifts in luck, while neglecting the only domain where we truly hold sway, the quality of our own presence and the depth of our own character. There is a quiet dignity in facing the uncertainty of tomorrow with a clear eye, recognizing that while we cannot dictate the terms of our existence, we can decide how we will meet them. The fear of scarcity is often a shadow cast by an infinite craving, a sense that if we could only possess just a little more, we would finally be safe, finally be enough, finally be at rest. But the hunger of the mind is a bottomless thing. The more it is fed by the acquisition of things, the more it learns to demand, and the more the horizon of enough recedes. To find a sense of sufficiency is to turn inward, to find the center of the storm where the movement of the world does not dictate the movement of the soul. In the quietude, one might observe that even in the most difficult of times, there is a core of being that remains untouched by the fluctuations of fortune. This core is not something that can be bought, sold, or lost. It is the silent witness to the thoughts and the anxieties, the steady presence that observes the racing mind without being swept away by it. When we stop identifying so closely with the frantic ledger keeper of our thoughts, we find a spaciousness that was previously obscured by the urgency of our wants. There is a certain grace in the recognition of our own vulnerability, an acceptance that to be human is to be subject to the winds of change. This acceptance is not a surrender to despair, but a surrender to reality, which is the only foundation upon which true resilience can be built. It is the wisdom of the reed that bends in the storm and survives, while the mighty oak, rigid in its defiance, is snapped by the gale. The reed does not fight the wind, it moves with it, acknowledging its power while remaining rooted in its own nature. As the night deepens, the weight of the world's demands may still feel heavy, but there is a subtle shift possible in how that weight is perceived. The dread of the future can be seen as a mental construction, a series of heavy stones being carried by a person who is actually standing in an open field. The uncertainty of life is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited, a fundamental truth that, when accepted, allows for a peace that does not depend on the absence of struggle, but on the presence of a quiet, unshakable center. The mind is a restless mathematician in the dark, perpetually calculating the distance between what is held and what is needed, tracing the jagged lines of debt and the looming shadows of scarcity. It is a heavy labor, this attempt to build a fortress out of numbers, to construct a sanctuary of security out of coins and ledgers that are, by their very nature, transient and subject to the turning of the wheel. There is an exhausting, silent project that occurs in the quiet hours, where the spirit tries to manufacture a tomorrow that is safe, as if a perfect arrangement of circumstances could finally grant a person permanent residence in a state of unshakable stability. This pursuit of a solid foundation is a profound human ache, a desire to grasp the hem of the world and hold it fast so that the future might not slip away. Yet, there is a quiet truth that persists through the centuries. Security is not a thing that can be stockpiled like grain in a granary, nor is it a destination that can be reached by a long and arduous journey of accumulation. The very concept of a life without risk is a phantom, an unlived imagination that torments the present with the specter of what might be lost. Consider the story of a merchant who spent his entire life building a wall around his garden, stone by stone, driven by the fear that the wind or the wandering beast might steal the beauty of his flowers. He worked through his youth, through his middle years, and into his old age, never once sitting to enjoy the scent of the jasmine or the sight of the blooming lilies, for his eyes were always fixed on the cracks in the masonry. When he was finally old and the wall was complete, he found that he had become a prisoner of his own defense, watching the horizon for threats rather than watching the sunlight dance upon the petals. He had successfully protected the garden, but he had lost the capacity to live within it. In this way, the dread of poverty often becomes a poverty of the spirit, a state where the mind is so preoccupied with the void of what might be missing that it fails to inhabit the fullness of what is actually present. The fear of not having enough creates a scarcity that is more real than any lack of currency, for it is a hunger that grows even as it is fed, a craving that seeks to fill a vessel that has no bottom. The wisdom of the ages suggests that the suffering we experience is often composed of two distinct arrows. The first arrow is the actual hardship of existence, the sudden loss of a job, the rising cost of bread, the unforeseen illness, the unavoidable fluctuations of fortune. These are the inevitable frictions of being alive, the natural movement of a world that is in constant flux. The second arrow, however, is the one we shoot into ourselves, the layer of anguish, the mental arithmetic of catastrophe, the frantic grasping at a stability that was never promised, the self-judgment that one is somehow failing because the world is not conforming to their needs. This second arrow is the product of a mind that refuses to accept the groundlessness of being, a mind that demands the ocean be still so that it might walk upon the waves. To live is to exist upon a shifting tide, and the attempt to stand still upon the water by clutching at it only leads to a deeper sinking. There is a profound distinction to be made between the external circumstances of a life and the internal landscape of the soul. The world may grant a person abundance, or it may grant them lack, for the wheel of fortune turns with a relentless and indifferent rhythm, bringing the high to the low and the low to the high. One may possess great wealth and yet live in a state of constant, trembling poverty, always fearing the loss of what has been gathered, forever standing on the precipice of ruin. Conversely, one may possess very little in the eyes of the world, and yet live with a richness that is entirely unshakable, because their sense of self is not anchored to the shifting sands of possession. This is the way of the wise, who have learned to be at home in both the feast and the famine, understanding that their essence is not defined by what they hold in their hands, but by the quality of their presence in the midst of whatever is arriving. There was once a traveler who came upon a river that was swollen and turbulent, its waters churning with silt and debris. He sat by the bank, paralyzed by the impossibility of crossing, terrified that the current would sweep him away and leave him with nothing. He sat there for days, watching the water, his mind a storm of calculations regarding the depth of the river and the strength of the current. He was so consumed by the fear of the crossing that he forgot the beauty of the forest around him and the song of the birds in the canopy. He was waiting for the river to be calm, for the water to be still and predictable, but the river has no such obligation to the traveler. It is the nature of the river to flow, to change, and to be unpredictable. The traveler's suffering did not come from the river itself, but from his refusal to accept that he was standing on the edge of something that could not be controlled. To seek security in the external world is to seek a permanence that does not exist in the fabric of reality. Everything that arises must pass. Every mountain eventually becomes sand, and every empire eventually becomes dust. This is not a thought meant to induce despair, but a realization meant to induce a profound, quiet lightness. When the fundamental truth of impermanence is integrated into the heart, the grip of anxiety begins to loosen. Not because the world has become safer, but because the need for it to be permanent has been surrendered. This is the essence of non-attachment. It is not a cold indifference to life, but a gentle letting go of the frantic attempt to freeze the moment, to own the wind, or to command the stars. It is the realization that one can be deeply involved in the dance of existence without being crushed by its unpredictability. The mind often treats the future as if it were a tangible place, a destination where one will finally be safe, finally settled, and finally at peace. It constructs elaborate landscapes of security, building mental monuments to a version of oneself that is no longer under threat. But the future is nothing more than a ghost, a phantom of the imagination that exists only in the tension between what is and what might be. When the mind is lost in these mental simulations, it is a form of exile from the only reality that is actually inhabited. The weight of the world's uncertainty is often the weight of a future that has not yet arrived, a burden carried by a person who is currently standing in the only moment that truly exists. There is a deep, ancestral wisdom in the way the body relates to the present moment, a way of being that exists beneath the frantic calculations of the intellect. The body is a vessel of constant, subtle movement, a living testament to the flow of life that requires no thought and no effort to maintain. Within the physical self, there is a rhythm that is much older than the worries of the bank account or the anxieties of the career. This rhythm is the quiet pulse of existence, a constant coming and going that mirrors the ebb and flow of the tides. When the mind is caught in a storm of thought, there is a subtle, silent reality that remains untouched by the tempest, a vast, spacious awareness that is simply the witness to the storm. This awareness is not something to be attained or manufactured. It is the very ground upon which the thoughts arise and dissolve. Consider a mountain that is shrouded in clouds. The clouds may be dark and heavy, obscuring the peaks in swirling and chaotic patterns, but the mountain itself remains, unmoved by the movement of the mist. The clouds are the thoughts, the anxieties, and the fears that drift across the sky of the mind, rising and falling, obscuring the view for a time, but never actually altering the essence of the mountain. To mistake the clouds for the mountain is the source of all distress. To recognize the mountain as the context for the clouds is the beginning of a quiet, unshakable freedom. This mountain is the awareness that persists through the highs and lows of fortune, through the seasons of plenty and the winters of scarcity. In the quietest moments, when the noise of the world has faded and the struggle to make tomorrow safe has reached its point of exhaustion, there is a possibility of finding a different kind of stability. It is not the stability of a solid floor, but the stability of a dancer who finds balance through constant, subtle adjustment. It is the peace that comes from making peace with the groundlessness of life, from accepting that we are walking on a path that is constantly being formed beneath our feet. When the demand for a permanent, unchanging reality is set aside, the soul is no longer a refugee in its own life, but a guest who is at home in the movement of the world. The fear of not having enough begins to lose its teeth when one recognizes that the most essential parts of being, the capacity to witness, to feel, and to be present, cannot be taxed, cannot be lost, and cannot be taken away by any fluctuation of the market. There is a profound grace in the recognition that we are not the architects of the universe, but participants in its unfolding. The attempt to control the uncontrollable is the ultimate source of exhaustion, a war fought against the very nature of reality. To move from the stance of the combatant to the stance of the witness is to step out of the cycle of craving and resistance. This is the quiet freedom that is available when the heart stops asking the world for a guarantee and begins to simply accept the gift of the present in all its beautiful, terrifying, and uncertain splendor. The arithmetic of anxiety is a tireless machine, a relentless counting of deficits and debts that seeks to solve the unsolvable equation of tomorrow. It is the mind's attempt to build a fortress out of numbers, hoping that if the sum is large enough, the walls will hold against the chaos of the world. Yet, even the most fortified treasury is subject to the turning of the great wheel, that ancient cycle where fortune flows in and flows out, indifferent to the desperation of those who grasp at it. There is a certain tragedy in the belief that security is a destination one can finally reach, a place where the ledger finally balances and the wind ceases to blow. In truth, the pursuit of absolute security is a pursuit of a mirage. The more one tries to solidify the shifting sands of the future, the more one finds themselves exhausted by the very act of holding on. There was once a merchant who spent his entire life collecting gold, building a granary so large it touched the clouds, and a treasury so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He believed that if he could simply accumulate enough, he would finally be safe from the whims of the seasons and the cruelty of the droughts. He spent his nights counting his coins by candlelight, his eyes growing dim, his heart growing heavy with the weight of what he owned. When a great flood finally came, it did not care for the height of his granary or the thickness of his walls. It swept away the grain and the gold with the same indifference it showed to the common dust. In the silence that followed, the merchant sat among the wreckage, and for the first time in his life, he realized that he had spent his life guarding a shadow. For the only thing he truly possessed was the capacity to be there, amidst the ruins, breathing in the damp air of a world that refused to be owned. This exhaustion stems from the subtle, heavy burden of the second arrow. If life strikes us with the first arrow, the sudden loss, the unexpected bill, the scarcity that bites at the edges of our existence. It is a pain that is part of the human condition, a natural part of the friction of living. But the mind, in its frantic attempt to protect itself, fires a second arrow at its own heart. This second arrow is the dread, the what if, the relentless replay of catastrophes that have not yet happened and may never occur. It is the suffering we layer upon our circumstances through the act of grasping. We do not merely suffer the lack of resources. We suffer the fear of the lack, the shame of the insufficiency, and the agonizing anticipation of a ruin that remains only a ghost in the mind. The mind treats a possibility as if it were a present reality, turning a potential shadow into a crushing weight that must be carried through every waking hour. To be caught in this cycle is to be like a man trying to stand on the surface of a river by clutching at the water. The more one reaches down to grab the current, to make the water still and solid beneath one's feet, the more the hands slip, and the more the body is pulled under by the very movement one seeks to arrest. Peace does not come from making the water still. Peace comes from the realization that we are part of the flow, and that the movement is not an enemy to be conquered, but the very nature of the river itself. The wise person does not seek to stop the current, but to find a way to float, to move with the water rather than against it, understanding that the surface is always in motion and never truly solid. There is a profound, quiet dignity in the recognition that our worth is not a variable in a calculation. The world may fluctuate, the economy may heave, and the structures we have built may crumble, but the essential nature of your being remains untouched by the fluctuations of the market. There is a vastness within the human heart that is capable of holding both abundance and scarcity, both the feast and the famine, without being broken by either. When the mind becomes a ledger of what is missing, it loses sight of the vast, unquantifiable presence that is already here, the capacity to witness the stars, to feel the cool air, to exist in the simple, unadorned fact of being. Consider the story of a traveler who walked through a vast, scorched desert, carrying nothing but a small canteen of water. He was obsessed with the horizon, terrified that he would not find an oasis, and he spent his energy calculating the distance to the next well, his mind a desert of its own, parched by the heat of his own anxiety. He was so consumed by the fear of thirst that he failed to see the beauty of the light upon the dunes, or the way the wind shaped the sand into intricate, fleeting sculptures. He arrived at an oasis, but he was too depleted by his own terror to enjoy the water. He spent his time there only wondering how much further the next stretch of sand would take him. He had traveled through a world of wonders, but he had only ever experienced the desert of his own apprehension. The fear of not having enough is often a mask for a deeper, more ancient loneliness, the feeling that we are separate from the world and must struggle against it to ensure our survival. This sense of separation is the root of all craving, the hunger that no amount of accumulation can ever truly satisfy. Even the wealthiest man can be a beggar if his mind is constantly reaching for the next thing, for the person who wants more is always, in some sense, lacking. True wealth is not found in the expansion of one's possessions, but in the contraction of one's grasping. It is the ability to look at the emptiness of the future and find it not terrifying, but spacious. In the quiet hours when the world falls away and the mind begins its restless counting, there is an opportunity to observe the thoughts as they arise, like clouds passing through a wide and empty sky. You are not the clouds, you are the sky. The clouds may be dark and heavy with the storm of financial dread. They may be light and fleeting, but they do not change the nature of the sky itself. The sky remains vast, open, and unaffected by the weather passing through it. The thoughts of debt, the images of failure, the mental rehearsals of struggle, these are merely weather. They come, they swirl, and they pass, leaving the vastness of your awareness intact. There is a great, silent truth that resides in the heart of impermanence. Nothing is permanent. which means that neither the hardship nor the scarcity is permanent. The very nature of reality is change, a constant flux of rising and falling, of coming into being and passing away. When we accept this, we find that we are no longer fighting against the fundamental rhythm of existence. We stop demanding that the world be a static monument to our security and begin to see it as a dance of constant transformation. This does not mean that life is not difficult or that the struggles of the material world are not real. It means that we no longer feel the need to make those struggles the center of our identity. A woman once lived in a village plagued by constant change, where the winds shifted the river's path every few years and the rains were unpredictable. While others spent their lives building heavy stone walls to protect their gardens from the shifting silt, she chose to plant in raised beds with movable borders. She knew that the river would eventually come, and that the land would change, and that her work would be undone. When the floods came, she did not stand in the mud cursing the water. She watched it move, knowing that the silt left behind would nourish her soil for the next season. She lived with a quiet, steady grace, not because she was immune to the hardship, but because she had made peace with the groundlessness of the earth. We are all travelers on uncertain ground, walking a path that is being shaped even as we step upon it. To demand that the ground be solid is to demand that the world cease to be what it is. There is a liberation in acknowledging that we are walking on water, that the future is a mist that dissolves as we approach it, and that the only true footing we have is the present moment in all its precarious, beautiful uncertainty. The weight of the world becomes lighter when we stop trying to carry it and instead allow ourselves to be carried by the vast, unfolding movement of life itself. There is a peace that surpasses the logic of the ledger, a quietude that exists even when the accounts are empty, found only when the heart stops seeking a fortress and begins to find its home in the openness of the now. The shadows we cast are often more heavy than the objects that create them. We spend much of our lives tending to the darkness of our own self-judgment, replaying every error and every perceived inadequacy as if they were permanent stains upon the fabric of our character. We treat our mistakes as if they were etched in granite, forgetting that the self is not a finished monument, but a living, breathing process of constant becoming. The person you were 10 years ago is not the person you are now, and the person you will be tomorrow is currently being shaped by the very awareness that is witnessing this moment. This fluidity is the nature of being. To hold on to a past version of oneself is to try to catch a falling leaf and command it to stay green and supple forever. There is a profound kindness in recognizing that you are a part of a much larger, more complex tapestry, one that requires the dark threads of struggle to give depth and meaning to the light. Without the shadow, the light would have no shape. Without the descent, there could be no ascent. We often fear the descent, the periods of loneliness or the seasons of quiet desolation, yet it is in those very hollows that the soul finds its capacity for depth. It is in the emptiness of the winter that the strength of the spring is gathered. When the mind is loud with the voices of comparison, the subtle aching sense that others are moving faster, achieving more, or possessing a lightness that we lack, it is helpful to remember that comparison is a phantom. It is a mirage born of the illusion that we are separate entities competing in a race, rather than a single, interconnected movement of life. The flower does not compare its bloom to the sun, nor does the mountain feel diminished by the height of the clouds. They simply exist in their own unfolding. To exist in your own unfolding is to stop measuring your life against the curated illusions of others, and to begin honoring the unique rhythm of your own presence. This requires a radical acceptance of the present, not as a problem to be solved or a waiting room for a better future, but as the only reality that truly exists. The past is a memory of a movement that has already ceased, and the future is a projection of a movement that has not yet begun. There is nothing to be conquered in the now, only to be witnessed. When the racing thoughts arrive, they are like birds nesting in the branches of a tree. They may flutter and cry. They may disturb the air with their frantic energy, but they do not change the substance of the wood or the strength of the roots. You are the tree, steady and grounded, and the thoughts are merely the guests that come and go in the wind. There is a quiet, unshakable strength that arises when you stop trying to be the architect of every circumstance and instead become the witness of the unfolding mystery. The mind is a relentless mathematician, a tireless clerk that works long after the world has fallen silent, tallying the debts of yesterday and the potential deficits of tomorrow. It carries the heavy, invisible weight of numbers, calculating the distance between what is held and what is required, building a fortress of anxiety out of mere abstractions. There is an exhaustion in this constant arithmetic, a fatigue that settles deep within the marrow when the soul attempts to solve for an unknown variable in a life that is inherently unpredictable. It is a profound human ache, this sense of precarity, this feeling that safety is a phantom always retreating just beyond the horizon of our reach. We spend our days attempting to engineer a certainty that does not exist, trying to build a wall of gold or a dam of stability against the inevitable tides of change. We treat security as a destination, a place where we might finally arrive and sit in quiet repose, believing that if we can only gather enough, or save enough, or control enough, the tremors of existence will finally cease. Yet, the nature of the world is not one of permanence, but of constant flowing transformation. The Stoics observed that the things we most desperately seek to possess, wealth, status, even the health of our bodies, are externals, elements that belong to the realm of what is not ours to command. They are gifts of fortune that may be bestowed or withdrawn by the turning wheel of the universe, and to anchor one's sense of self to these shifting sands is to invite a lifetime of turbulence. There is a certain madness in trying to own the weather, or to command the tides to stay at a constant level. When the mind clings to the idea of a permanent state of sufficiency, it creates a tension that is more painful than the scarcity itself. The true poverty is not found in a hollow purse, but in the grasping heart that believes it can never have enough, a hunger that expands the more it is fed. There is an old tale of a traveler who walked through a vast, sun-scorched desert, carrying a heavy jar of water as if it were his very soul. He walked with a stiff, trembling gait, terrified that a single spill would mean his certain end. He watched the horizon with eyes clouded by dread, seeing only the emptiness of the dunes and the distance to the next oasis. Because he was so consumed by the preservation of his liquid treasure, he failed to see the beauty of the shifting light on the sand, or the shade of the rare acacia tree, or the quiet dignity of the desert wind. He was alive in the desert, but he was not experiencing it. He was merely managing a crisis. He was so busy protecting his life that he had forgotten to actually live it. In his frantic gripping, he had become a slave to the very thing intended to sustain him. When we face the dread of bills or the shadow of an empty account, the mind often fires a second arrow into the wound of our circumstances. The first arrow is the reality of the situation, the genuine hardship, the lack, the material struggle. This is the pain of the human condition, a fact of life that cannot be avoided. But the second arrow is the suffering we add to that reality through our mental reaction. It is the layer of judgment, the spiral of what if, the frantic replay of failures, and the crushing weight of self-reproach. The first arrow is a wound. The second arrow is the agony of the spirit. We often find ourselves bleeding from the second arrow, exhausted by the mental theater of our own inadequacy, mourning a future that has not happened and a security that was never truly ours to hold. There is a profound wisdom in recognizing that one cannot stand on the surface of the ocean by clutching at the water. To try to grasp the waves is to find only emptiness in one's hands and a great deal of turbulence in one's spirit. The water is meant to move, to rise and fall, to flow in and out with a rhythm that defies human control. To find peace, the realization is not that the water will stop moving, but that the struggle to hold it is what causes the drowning. There is a quiet, radical freedom that begins to emerge when the hand is opened. It is not a surrender to despair, but a surrender to the truth of impermanence. It is the recognition that we are living on a ground that is always shifting, and that to be truly present is to learn how to dance upon that instability rather than demanding it be solid. The mind often treats the future as a solid landscape that we must navigate, but the future is nothing more than an unlived imagination, a ghost that haunts the corridors of the present. We torment ourselves with the specter of a poverty that has not arrived, treating a possibility as if it were a present catastrophe. We live in a state of perpetual preparation for a crisis that may never come, and in doing so, we miss the only moment where we actually exist. The tension of the not enough is a ghost that feeds on the substance of the now. When the mind begins its frantic calculations in the dark, it is often trying to buy a peace that no amount of money can ever provide, for the peace it seeks is the absence of change, and change is the only constant. Consider the story of a weaver who lived in a small village, a person who feared that the threads of her life were fraying and that she would one day have nothing to weave with. She spent every waking hour obsessing over the quality of her wool, the scarcity of her dyes, and the potential for the loom to break. She lived in a state of constant, muted panic, her heart always racing at the thought of the next shortage. One day, a stranger passed through her shop and watched her work with eyes that seemed to see through the fabric and into her very soul. The stranger noted that the weaver was so preoccupied with the thread that she had forgotten the pattern. The weaver was so focused on the fear of running out that she never saw the intricate, beautiful design she was creating in the very moment of her labor. The pattern only reveals itself in the movement of the shuttle, in the continuous flow of the work, not in the hoarding of the thread. There is a deep, compassionate kindness that is required when the mind turns its judgment upon itself for its own anxieties. We often treat our fear as a character flaw, viewing our worry as a sign of weakness or a lack of faith, and this self-judgment becomes a heavy burden layered upon the original stress. We become our own most relentless taskmasters, scolding the heart for its trembling. But the heart is not a machine. It is a living, breathing part of a fragile being, and its trembling is a natural response to the overwhelming scale of existence. To look upon one's own fear with the same gentleness one might offer a frightened child is a profound act of internal reconciliation. It is the understanding that the fear is not you, but a storm passing through you. It is a weather pattern of the mind, not the sky itself. The sky remains wide and vast, even when the clouds are dark and the lightning is fierce. The clouds are the thoughts of scarcity, the heavy gray masses of not enough and what if. But they are not the sky. The sky is the capacity in which these thoughts arise, the spaciousness that holds the storm without being changed by it. To find a sense of home in the midst of precarity is to identify with the sky rather than the clouds. It is to realize that even when the winds of economic change or personal loss howl through the branches, the vastness of your own being remains untouched, an unshakable witness to the movement. There is a way of being that allows for a quiet dignity, even in the presence of lack. The wise person recognizes that their value is not a variable in an equation of assets or liabilities. A person's worth is not something that can be tallied, nor is it something that can be depleted by the loss of worldly things. There is a core of being that is independent of the external movement of the world, a center of gravity that does not depend on the accumulation of security. This is not a philosophy of indifference, but a philosophy of profound presence. To be at home in both plenty and lack is to understand that the quality of one's life is not determined by the circumstances of one's possession, but by the quality of one's relationship to those circumstances. The Buddha once spoke of the two arrows, suggesting that while we cannot avoid the first arrow of pain, we can avoid the second arrow of suffering. This is a profound distinction for the soul navigating a world of uncertainty. The first arrow is the hunger, the debt, the empty cupboard, the sudden loss of a livelihood. These are the realities of a world governed by cause and effect, and the inevitable decay of all things. They are real, and they demand our attention. But the second arrow is the mental anguish we add to them, the shame of having little, the terror of the unknown, the frantic, grasping attempt to control the uncontrollable. When the second arrow is removed, the first arrow still leaves a mark, but it no longer consumes the entire being. There is room to breathe, room to exist, and room to find a quiet, steady grace even amidst the struggle. In the quiet hours, when the mind begins its weary cycle of arithmetic, there is a possibility of shifting from the role of the accountant to the role of the observer. One may witness the numbers as they arise, observe the fear as it pulses through the body, and see the scenarios as they play out in the imagination without being swept away by them. It is to see the thought, "I will not have enough," as a movement of the mind, a passing cloud, a transient electrical impulse, rather than an absolute truth. This observation does not require any effort of will. It is simply the recognition of what is actually occurring in the theater of consciousness. True security is not found in a bank, nor in a contract, nor in a pile of possessions, for all such things are subject to the great, unceasing movement of time. Real security is the ability to stand in the center of the storm and know that you are not the storm. It is the realization that you are the space in which the storm arises, a space that is never diminished by what it contains. There is a profound, unshakable peace that is available when we stop demanding that the world be predictable and instead find our footing in the very heart of the unpredictable. It is a peace that does not rely on the absence of trouble, but on the presence of a deep, abiding acceptance of the way things are, and the courage to exist fully within the unfolding, ungraspable mystery of life. The weight of the world often feels most heavy when the noise of the day has finally subsided, leaving only the quiet, persistent arithmetic of survival to echo in the silence. It is in these hours that the mind begins its tireless work of building fortresses out of paper and numbers, attempting to construct a sanctuary out of things that are, by their very nature, fleeting. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from the relentless effort to secure a future that has not yet arrived, a labor spent trying to build a wall against the inevitable tides of change. This anxiety is often a shadow cast by the belief that if we could only gather enough, or plan precisely enough, or hold on tightly enough, we might finally achieve a state of permanent safety. We treat security as if it were a destination, a place we will eventually reach once the debts are cleared, the savings are sufficient, and the uncertainty is banished. Yet, the more we grasp at the hem of certainty, the more it slips through our fingers, leaving us with nothing but the ache of a perpetual reaching. There was once a merchant who spent his entire life accumulating grain, silver, and silk, convinced that his greatness lay in the depth of his storehouses. He lived in constant fear of a bad harvest, a sudden fire, or a change in the winds of trade, and so he spent every waking moment calculating the cost of his potential ruin. He became a man possessed by the math of loss, unable to taste his food or enjoy the sun, because his mind was always in the counting house, weighing what he had against what he might lose. When a great flood eventually swept through his valley, taking his granaries and his gold, the merchant sat amidst the silt and realized a terrifying truth. He had been living in a state of poverty his entire life, for he had been a slave to the fear of losing what he had not yet even truly possessed. He had spent his vitality guarding a shadow, and in the process, he had missed the very life he was trying to protect. This merchant's struggle is the struggle of the human heart when it encounters the reality of precarity. We often mistake the accumulation of resources for the attainment of peace, failing to see that the anxiety we feel is not caused by the lack of things, but by the desperate craving for things to stay exactly as they are. There is a profound difference between the hardship of a difficult circumstance and the suffering we layer upon that hardship through our mental resistance to it. When a storm arises, there's the wind and the rain, which are simply the movements of the world. Then there is the internal storm of our judgment, our protests, and our frantic attempts to stop the clouds, which is the weight we truly carry. To suffer is often to be struck by the first arrow of circumstance, but to live in a state of chronic dread is to strike ourselves repeatedly with a second arrow of our own making. A second arrow born of the refusal to accept the inherent instability of all things. The world is a river, ever moving, never the same from one moment to the next, and to demand that the river stand still is to demand the impossible. We attempt to build our houses on the water, trying to find a footing on the very thing that is defined by its flow, and we wonder why we feel so unsteady. There is a quiet, radical freedom that begins to emerge when we realize that we cannot stand on water by clutching it more tightly. Rather, we find balance by learning how to move with the current. This does not mean a disregard for the necessities of life, but rather a shift in where our center of gravity is held. If our center is placed in the things that can be taken away, in our status, our wealth, our health, our very reputations, then we are forever subject to the whims of fortune, tossed about by every rise and fall of the great wheel. Consider the sage who walks through the marketplace, seeing both the palace and the hovel with the same steady eye. To such a person, wealth is an external thing, a guest that arrives and departs as it pleases, and poverty is merely another guest. They do not find their worth in the abundance of their possessions, nor do they lose their dignity in their lack, because their foundation is not built on the shifting sands of the external world. They understand that true richness is not the possession of many things, but the desire for very few. This is not a call to asceticism, but an observation of the nature of contentment, for the one who is satisfied with what is sufficient is never truly poor, while the one who is never satisfied is always in want, regardless of how much they hold in their hands. The mind is a restless architect, constantly designing elaborate structures of if only and what if. It builds a future of terrifying possibilities, a landscape of catastrophes that have not happened and may never happen, and then it inhabits that imaginary landscape as if it were the present reality. We torment ourselves with the ghosts of things that do not exist, treating a potential lack as if it were a current deprivation. We live in the shadow of a tomorrow that is always retreating, a horizon that moves as we approach it, and in doing so, we lose the only ground that is actually real, the present moment. The future is a phantom, a collection of thoughts and projections that possess no substance of their own, yet we allow them to dictate the quality of our current existence. There is an old story of a traveler who was walking through a desert, carrying a heavy jar of water that was his most precious possession. He was so preoccupied with protecting the jar, with shielding it from the sun and ensuring it did not tip, that he forgot to drink. He walked with a bent back, his eyes fixed solely on the vessel, and he never looked up to see the beauty of the stars or the vastness of the horizon. He reached his destination with the water still mostly intact, but he was so withered and depleted by the effort of the journey that he had no strength left to enjoy the oasis he had sought. He had survived the journey, but he had not lived it. We often find ourselves in a similar state, so consumed by the effort of securing our survival that we have forgotten the purpose of being alive. We are often haunted by the fear of ruin, the dread that the floor will fall away beneath us. Yet, if we look closely at the nature of existence, we see that the floor has always been somewhat porous, the ground always somewhat unsettled. The universe is characterized by impermanence. Everything that arises must also pass away. This is not a cause for despair, but a call to a different kind of presence. When we accept that change is the only constant, we stop being surprised by it. We stop treating the natural cycles of loss and gain as personal affronts or cosmic injustices. We begin to see that the ebb and flow of fortune is not a reflection of our worth, but the natural rhythm of a world in constant motion. There is a profound stillness that resides beneath the frantic calculations of the mind, a quietude that does not require the absence of problems to exist. It is the stillness of the deep ocean, which remains calm and vast, even while the surface is churned by storms and currents. This stillness is not something that is achieved by solving all our problems or by accumulating enough resources to feel safe. It is something that is discovered when we stop trying to control the uncontrollable. It is the recognition that we are more than our anxieties, more than our bank balances, and more than the stories we tell ourselves about our inadequacy. We are the space in which these thoughts arise, the vast, unconditioned awareness that observes the movement of the world without being swept away by it. When we stop demanding that life be a solid, unyielding thing, we find that we can stand on even the most uncertain ground. There is a grace in the surrender to the reality of our limitations, a lightness in the realization that we are not required to carry the entire weight of the future on our shoulders. The burden of trying to make tomorrow safe is a weight that no human being was meant to bear. It is an illusion of agency that only serves to deepen our exhaustion. To live with a sense of spaciousness is to move through the world with a lighter touch, recognizing that while we must act within the world, we do not need to be owned by it. In the quiet of the night, when the mind begins its old, tired patterns of counting and fearing, there is the possibility of a different kind of rest. It is a rest that comes not from the cessation of thought, but from a change in our relationship to it. We can see the thoughts as they are, passing clouds in a vast sky, ripples on a deep lake, or voices in a crowded room. They arise, they play their part, and they dissolve. They do not need to be grasped, and they do not need to be fought. There is a profound, unshakable peace that is available when we stop seeking a permanent refuge in the world, and instead find our footing in the very heart of the unfolding, ungraspable mystery of being. The mind, in its relentless pursuit of safety, often turns into a frantic clerk, tallying the debts of the soul and the deficits of the purse long after the world has gone quiet. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from the mental arithmetic of survival. The way the numbers seem to dance and multiply in the dark, creating a phantom landscape of scarcity that feels more real than the air in the room. This dread is a heavy, invisible weight, a sense of standing on a ledge where the wind is always blowing, and the future is a vast, hungry mouth that promises nothing but more demands. We spend so much of our vitality constructing elaborate fortresses of security, attempting to build walls out of coin and contract, as if we could somehow negotiate with the inherent instability of existence. We treat tomorrow as a problem to be solved, a math equation that, if answered correctly, will finally grant us the permission to be at peace. Yet, this project of making the future safe is a labor that can never be completed, for the very nature of time is a river that refuses to be dammed. There was once a merchant who spent his entire life collecting grains of sand, convinced that if he could only gather enough to fill a great vessel, he would never again know hunger or fear. He worked from sunrise until the stars appeared, his hands calloused and his eyes dimming, always one handful short of the security he believed was just beyond his reach. He lived his entire life in the shadow of the next handful, never tasting the grain he had already gathered, for his mind was always at the vessel's edge, mourning the emptiness. He died with a mountain of sand beside him, yet he died as a beggar, because he had never actually lived in the abundance of his own breath, only in the perceived lack of his storehouse. This merchant's plight is the quiet tragedy of the human heart, which seeks to find permanence in a world made of flux. We often mistake the accumulation of things for the attainment of stability, failing to see that the things we grasp are subject to the same laws of rise and fall as the seasons. There is a profound difference between the external circumstances of one's life and the internal state of one's being. One can be surrounded by gold and be a prisoner to the fear of losing it, while another can walk through the world with nothing but a clear mind and remain utterly unshaken. The wise recognize that wealth and fortune are merely borrowed things lent to us by the universe for a brief moment before they are reclaimed. They are externals, shifting and unpredictable, governed by a wheel that turns without regard for our preferences or our plans. To tether one's peace to the movement of that wheel is to invite a lifetime of vertigo. The weight of financial anxiety is often doubled by the second arrow, that subtle and devastating act of adding suffering to the hardship that has already arrived. If a storm destroys a crop, the storm is the first arrow. The anguish, the self-judgment, and the frantic circling thoughts about the next season are the second arrow. The first arrow is a matter of circumstance, a movement of the world that we cannot control. But the second arrow is a movement of the mind, a choice to suffer more than the situation requires. We punish ourselves for the uncertainty of the world, turning a simple lack of resources into a profound crisis of identity, believing that our worth is measured by the balance in an account rather than the depth of our presence. Consider the traveler who finds himself in a desert, thirsty and weary, seeing a mirage of a lush oasis on the horizon. He spends his remaining strength running toward the shimmering water, ignoring the shade of the few scrub trees along his path, only to find that the oasis was a trick of the light and the water was never there. The mirage is the promise of the enough that always remains just out of reach, the idea that once we reach a certain threshold of comfort, the anxiety will finally cease. But the enough is a ghost, a phantom limb that twitches with a hunger that can never be satisfied by the material world, for the hunger itself is a feature of the mind's endless craving. This craving, this constant reaching for what is not here, creates a fundamental sense of precarity, a feeling that we are perpetually standing on the edge of ruin. We view the future as an unlived imagination, a terrifying landscape of what-ifs that we populate with monsters of debt and deprivation. We treat the future as a destination where we will finally be safe, forgetting that we only ever inhabit the present and that the future is merely a thought occurring now. By living in that imaginary unformed time, we abandon the only ground that is actually beneath our feet, leaving us to stumble through a life we are not truly participating in. There is a quiet dignity in the realization that one cannot stand on water by clutching it more tightly. The more we attempt to grasp the fluid, changing nature of our lives, our status, our possessions, our very security, the more we find ourselves sinking into the turbulence of our own grasping. There is a profound freedom that emerges when we stop demanding that the ground be solid, when we accept that to be alive is to be held by a universe that is fundamentally uncertain. This is not a call to indifference, but an invitation to a different kind of engagement, one that is rooted in the present moment rather than in a frantic attempt to secure a permanent future. In the ancient teachings, there is a story of a man who lost everything in a great flood. He sat on a high rock, watching his possessions drift away in the churning currents, and he felt a deep, hollow ache of loss. But as the waters receded, he realized that the things he had lost were merely objects that had been passing through his life, and that the essence of who he was remained untouched by the tide. He had been trying to build a home out of the debris of the flood, when he should have been building a home within the stillness of his own heart. He learned that to be at home in the world is to be at home in both the abundance and the lack, to move through the world with a lightness of being that is not dependent on what is held in the hand, but on the quality of the awareness that holds it. When we stop viewing scarcity as a personal failure and see it instead as a natural part of the ebb and flow of existence, the grip of anxiety begins to loosen. We begin to see that the dread we feel is often not about the lack of things, but about the lack of acceptance. We struggle against the reality of our precarity, fighting a war against the very nature of life, and in that struggle, we lose the ability to see the beauty of what is actually present. The wise person understands that poverty is not the absence of possessions, but the presence of an insatiable wanting. It is the shadow cast by the ego's constant demand for more. To be rich is to be content with the sufficiency of the moment, to recognize that the breath in our lungs and the light in our eyes are the only true certainties we can ever possess. The transition from the frantic activity of the day to the stillness of the night is often a movement from the noise of the ego to the silence of the self. In the daylight, we are defined by our roles, our duties, and our struggles to secure our place in the hierarchy of the world. We are the workers, the earners, the planners, the worriers. But as the light fades, these identities begin to thin, losing their grip on our sense of being. The masks we wear to protect ourselves from the world's uncertainties begin to slip, revealing the quiet, unadorned reality of existence that has been there all along, beneath the layers of thought and striving. There is a certain grace in the surrender to the day's end, a recognition that the work of being human is, for now, complete. The world continues its rotation, indifferent to our anxieties and our triumphs, moving with a slow, majestic inevitability that reminds us of our own smallness and our own interconnectedness. There is a peace that can be found in this smallness, a relief in realizing that we are not the masters of the cosmos, but merely guests within it. We do not need to carry the weight of the world's uncertainty into the quiet hours. We can simply witness it, acknowledging its presence without becoming lost in its complexity. As the shadows lengthen and the world settles into its nocturnal rhythm, there is a sense of everything returning to its natural state, a folding back of the many into the one. The thoughts that raced through the mind earlier, the numbers, the bills, the fears of the unknown remain, but they no longer seem to be part of us. They are merely sounds in the distance or ripples on a surface that is slowly becoming smooth again. We are the space in which these things occur, the vast and silent container that remains even when the contents are in constant motion. The day does not end with a resolution of all problems, but with the simple, profound acceptance of their existence. It is a quiet surrender to the fact that the world is as it is, and that we are here, breathing, amidst the unfolding mystery. In this stillness, there is no need to plan, no need to secure, and no need to defend. There is only the gentle, rhythmic pulse of existence, a steady movement that requires nothing from us but our presence. In the end, there is only the quiet, the stillness, and the grace of a day that has passed, leaving us to rest in the soft, unhurried embrace of the night.